Sweet, sticky molasses, used not in dessert, but in a deadly plan. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host Harrington. Every viewer matters. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your replies make each mystery feel like a shared experience. Let's dive in. It was exactly 9:06 a.m. when the molasses made its entrance. I was in the front room of the brownstone pretending to read the Gazette, while actually timing how long Fritz could go on about the superiority of sorrel over spinach in soup, without taking a breath. We were at the 7-minute mark when the doorbell rang. Fritz muttered something in German that wasn't about vegetables and vanished toward the kitchen. I beat him to the door, which, as he'd tell you with no lack of pride, took talent. We're a well-oiled operation, Fritz and me, but I've got the legs, and more importantly, the curiosity. I opened the door and came face to face with a man who looked like he'd just been mugged by a grocery store. His blazer had a sticky dark patch over the left lapel, and his expression suggested he hadn't noticed, or worse, didn't care. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. His voice was thin, clipped, and coated with anxiety, like a telemarketer selling life insurance after a fire. "That depends. Are you bringing a breakfast pastry or a subpoena?" He blinked, then gave a nervous half-smile. "Neither. My name is Anson Flegg. I need to speak with Nero Wolfe." He said the name like it was sacred, though the molasses on his coat dulled the effect a little. I stepped back and waved him in, mostly to keep him from leaking onto the sidewalk. "Follow me. But fair warning, if you plan to drip anything on the carpet, you better have a mop and a compelling reason." I led him into the front room. Wolfe hadn't come down yet. It was before 10, which meant the orchid still held his full attention. Fritz peeked out of the kitchen with a spoon in one hand and disapproval in the other. I gave him a nod that meant not a lunatic, probably, and escorted our guest to the red chair. Flegg sat stiffly, wiping at his lapel with a handkerchief that only made things worse. "I apologize," he said. "I didn't realize the jar had cracked until I was on the subway. I brought it as an example. Of molasses. Of motive," he said grimly. Now that got my interest. "Say more." "I manage a co-op on the Lower East Side. Heritage Spoon Foods. We sell artisanal syrups and preserves. Last night, someone broke into our storage room. But it wasn't a robbery. They didn't take anything except for one open jar." "So you want Wolfe to track down a syrup snatcher?" "No." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This morning I found that same jar emptied, poured over the driver's seat of my partner's car. The same partner who was found dead 2 hours later in his apartment. No signs of struggle. No broken lock. Just a spoon next to the body, and the smell of molasses everywhere." "Okay, I admit it. That crossed a line from odd to interesting." I sat up straighter. "You call the police?" He nodded. "They're treating it as a domestic accident. Said he probably spilled it himself, maybe drunk. But he wasn't a drinker, and I swear to you, someone hated him enough to make it symbolic." "Symbolic? How?" He swallowed. "Eldon, my partner, he used to say there's no justice sweeter than revenge. It was a joke, until this morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of soft footfalls descending the stairs. That meant Wolfe had paused his orchid ritual early, which in itself was a kind of miracle. Wolfe entered, expression sour. He stopped when he saw the molasses patch and scowled. "Archie," he said, "kindly explain why my air is being polluted with the scent of breakfast gone rogue." "This is Mr. Flegg," I said. "He brings syrup, death, and a line about revenge. In that order." Wolfe closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Speak." Succinctly, Flegg repeated the story. I noticed Wolfe's nostrils twitch at the word symbolic. He doesn't care for metaphor unless it involves botany or gastronomy. But his eyes opened just a hair wider at the phrase "no justice sweeter than revenge." When Flags finished, Wolfe sighed. Do you seek to hire me to find a killer, Mr. Flagg? Yeah, or at least to prove that there was a killer. Wolfe looked him over like he was debating whether to toss him out with the Sunday compost. Then he surprised both of us. Very well, leave your contact information with Mr. Goodwin. I will consider your case. Flagg blinked. But I thought I have no interest in your thoughts. Wolfe said. I require facts. Mr. Goodwin will visit your cooperative. You will give him full access. I will advise further after his report. Dismissal issued. Wolfe turned and made for the dining room. I heard him mutter, "Molasses. Phooey," under his breath. Flagg left 10 minutes later, dripping gratitude and residual sugar. I grabbed my coat. You want me to start with the co-op? Yes. Taste syrup, smell the blood, Wolfe said, without turning. It was going to be one of those cases. The Lower East Side wasn't exactly my regular beat, but I had a soft spot for food ventures, even if the crime scene in question involved molasses and a dead business partner. I flagged a cab and settled in for the ride, mentally flipping through what little I had on Anson Flagg's tight shoulders, anxious tone, an outfit ruined by breakfast-grade sabotage, and just enough restraint not to sob into Fritz's rug. He hadn't seemed like a liar, but he had that tight-coiled air of someone who might be hiding a few ingredients in the mix. Heritage Spoon Foods was housed in what used to be a bakery, judging from the faint mural still clinging to the side wall, something involving wheat sheaves, children, and a golden loaf that looked a little too heavenly. The signage for the co-op was newer, minimalist and self-consciously rustic. I pushed open the front door to the clink of a bell, and the immediate aroma of sugar, wood and earthy overtones. The place smelled like it took syrup serious. Inside, a woman with braided gray hair and a turquoise apron stood behind a counter, ladling something dark into glass jars. She looked up and offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You're not a supplier, she said, or a regular. Correct on both counts. I'm Archie Goodwin. I'm working with Nero Wolfe. Her smile dipped an inch. Mr. Flagg mentioned he might bring in outside help. I'm Mara Kelton. I do production and manage the storefront. She didn't offer to shake hands, which was fine. Her gloves were sticky, and I wasn't looking to add residue to my lapels. I understand you had a break-in, I said, keeping my tone light. And this morning, your partner was found dead. Her hands stilled, ladle halfway dipped. You make it sound like a recipe. You deal in syrups, I said. Occupational hazard. That earned the flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe amusement, maybe irritation. Hard to tell under the overhead bulbs. Eldon didn't deserve it, she said quiet. He had enemies. Don't let anyone tell you different. But not the kind who'd kill him. Not really. Tell me about those enemies. Start with our other partner, Leo Drum, she said. He didn't exactly get along with Eldon. They were like two cats forced to share a barrel. Clawing was inevitable. What about you? She didn't flinch. I didn't like him much either, but I respected him. Eldon was a brute in conversation and a tyrant in meetings, but he built this place out of dust and borrowed money. We wouldn't exist without him. Do you know why someone would pour molasses on his car seat? Symbolism, she said deadpan. Or maybe irony. He used to say you could sweeten poison if you used the right blend. That made two metaphor-heavy remarks about the dearly departed. Wolfe was going to frown himself into a stupor. Where can I find Leo Drum? Check the back office. He came in around 7, slammed a few cupboards, and hasn't emerged since. I assume he's sulking. She nodded toward a door at the. I headed that way, passing stacks of syrup crates, 2 racks of mason jars, and a handwritten sign offering discounts on blueberry lavender reduction. No blood, no broken windows, no dramatic evidence of chaos, just a tidy operation with a hidden undercurrent. The back office looked like a storm had considered forming, changed its mind, and then half committed anyway. The desk was covered in papers, 2 laptops and a coffee cup that might have been older than the co-op itself. Behind it sat a man with a square jaw, and the expression of someone who'd been asked to alphabetize insults. He didn't look up when I entered. You Leo Drum. If you're a health inspector we passed last week. I'm not, I said. I'm with Nero Wolfe. He finally glanced up, eyes sharp behind thick-framed glasses. Flag went crawling for help already. He came voluntarily. No crawling involved. Drum scoffed. Typical. The body isn't even cold and he's already playing victim. You think Anson killed Eldon? I think Anson wanted out of this place 6 months ago and couldn't sell his shares without Eldon's signature. And I think he hated Eldon more than he hated taxes, which is saying something. Did you hate Eldon too? He gave me a look like I'd asked whether syrup was sticky. Everyone did. He was brilliant, charismatic and emotionally undercooked. He micromanaged everything, ignored input, and rewrote contracts after they were signed, but he kept us afloat. He was the reason investors didn't laugh us out of the room. And now that the investors will panic, the paperwork will turn to sludge, and Flage will cry innocence until someone forces him to hire a lawyer. Where were you last night? He leaned back. At my sister's birthday dinner. 20 people, 2 cakes, 1 video of me singing off-key. Want a copy? Tempting, I said. But I'll settle for contact info. He jotted it down and slid the paper over with the kind of flair that implied he wanted it noted. I pocketed it. You know anything about a spoon being found next to the body? Drum hesitated. That sounds like a message. What kind of message? The passive, aggressive kind. Eldon used to say everyone in the business world carried a spoon. Some used it to stir, some to steal. He liked to think he could tell the difference. Another aphorism. I was starting to feel like I'd wandered into a fortune cookie convention. I left the office and took a quick circuit of the co-op, snapping a few pictures on my phone and noting the security setup. Basic cameras, no alarms and a back door with a lock that looked easy to bribe. When I stepped outside, the sun had shifted and so had my suspicion. Flage might have looked like a sapling in a windstorm, but he had a motive wrapped in shareholder ink. Drum had alibis, but also a grudge. And Mara Kelton had a serenity that might have been genuine, or very, very practiced. I caught a cab back to the brownstone. Wolfe was waiting in the office, his bulk arranged precisely in his chair, eyes closed but ears perked. Well? He asked. As I set my notebook down. We've got 3 business partners, 2 resentments and 1 dead man, who liked spoon metaphors. Wolfe grunted. I despise allegory. Then you're going to loathe this case. He opened his eyes. Did you learn anything useful? I learned that everyone hated Eldon, but no one claims to have killed him. Oh, and someone poured molasses on his car seat. Presumably to send a message. That is not a message, Wolfe said. That is a flourish. Someone is playing a part. He reached for his beer without further comment, and I knew what that meant. He was already constructing the lattice quietly, methodically, with every detail placed like a brick in a wall. Dinner would be at 7. By then he'd have questions. And if I knew Wolfe, one of them would be, why use molasses at all? And that question, as sticky as it sounded, was going to be the lever that opened this whole thing up. I hit the front stoop the next morning with a hot coffee in one hand and a head full of molasses. Not literally. I'd showered twice after returning from Heritage Spoon, but the image of that oozing revenge syrup had stuck to my brain like it had the dead man's upholstery. Wolfe hadn't summoned me for a midnight briefing, which meant he was still digesting mentally and physically. That left me free to stir the pot a bit more on my own. First up was a visit to Eldon's apartment, or what was left of it. I had called ahead and gotten a green light from a Lieutenant Rowcliffe I didn't particularly like but who liked me even less, which meant I was cleared to poke around so long as I didn't move the furniture or insult the NYPD's working theories out loud. The building was a 4-story walk-up near Delancey, The kind of place where hallways smelled like steam pipes and ambition. The super let me in with a grunt and a ring of keys that could have opened Fort Knox. Eldon's apartment was on the 3rd floor, neat in the way that suggested he hired someone to keep it that way. Nothing looked forced or overturned, no signs of struggle or hurry. Just a man who'd stopped living, without The kitchen was modern, minimal, and stocked with 3 varieties of artisanal mustard. The living room featured exactly 2 personal photos, one of Eldon shaking hands with a mayor I didn't recognize, and another of a woman I hadn't met yet, smiling with eyes that seemed to know too much. His body had been found slumped in the armchair by the window. The medical examiner's report delivered to me by Rowcliffe with all the warmth of a tax audit said heart failure. No signs of trauma, no alcohol, no drugs, and yet, the spoon was still there. I crouched to look at it. Stainless steel, clean, too perfectly placed. Sitting on a small side table, it looked less like an eating utensil and more like punctuation. The period at the end of a statement someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make subtle. I left without touching anything and made my way to the co-op's warehouse space. Fleas had mentioned the storage room break-in and I hadn't yet seen the scene of that particular crime. It was 2 blocks from the storefront in a shared industrial building, up one flight of stairs that creaked like they hated their job. The lock on the door had been replaced recently. A strip of tape still hung from one corner. Inside was orderly chaos, racks of jars, crates, labeled with blends that sounded like dessert and landscaping had a love child, and a tall rolling shelf that had obviously been recently rearranged. I snapped a few photos and was heading back toward the exit, when someone cleared their throat behind me. "You're Archie Goodwin, right?" The voice belonged to a young guy in coveralls with a mop handle in one hand, and a badge clipped to his chest that said Corey Fulfillment and Cleaning. He looked about 20 and exactly the kind of person people underestimate. "I am. You're Corey." He nodded. "Felice said someone might come by. I'm usually on prep detail, but I clean the warehouse when it's slow." "Were you the one who found the lock broken?" "No, Mara did. But I was here that day. I remember something weird though. When we did inventory 2 nights ago, 1 jar was missing from the spring batch. Spring batch, our limited run blend. Molasses, orange zest, clove. Eldon called it bitterness disguised. He made a big deal about the name. Anyway, the weird thing was the cap on that one was marked with red wax. But when Mara checked the shelf, it was gone. So not just any molasses, the molasses." He nodded. "We only had 6 jars left. Someone had to know which one to take." I scribbled that down. "You ever see anyone odd around the warehouse in the last few days?" He hesitated. "Yesterday before the cops came, I saw Leo Drum out front, just standing there, like he was waiting for someone. He saw me, turned and left. Didn't say anything." Interesting. Drum had claimed to be at a birthday party, but there was a window in the timeline before the cops arrived. A man could attend a party and still slip in some premeditated molasses meddling on the side. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in his office, finishing a bottle of beer with the reverence of a monk polishing a relic. He gestured toward the red chair, so I took it, flipping open my notebook. Eldon's apartment was spotless, no break-in. Medical examiner says natural cause, but the spoon was still there, deliberate. "Of course it was deliberate," Wolfe said. "A contrived prop in a staged tableau. Whoever placed it had confidence it would not be dismissed." I also visited the warehouse. A jar of their special blend, the bitterness disguised, was stolen, not a random pick. The thief wanted that molasses. Wolfe leaned back, lacing his fingers across his midsection. "So the molasses, the spoon and the phrasing, they form a triad of insinuation. Someone intended a message to be read, but not proven. And Leo Drum was spotted outside the warehouse the morning Eldon was found dead. Convenient. Corey, the cleaner, saw him, and according to Mara, Leo and Eldon couldn't share a coffee without biting through the cup. Wolfe grunted. Mr. Drum is worth further scrutiny. But this case is not yet ripe. I waited. He closed his eyes, then said, Mr. Goodwin, tomorrow you will ask Saul Panzer to shadow Mr. Drum. Quietly. You will also invite the 3 surviving co-op members here separately. I wish to smell their stories without the seasoning of each other's presence. What if they refuse? He opened his eyes slowly. They won't. And I believed him. As I rose to leave, he added, Molasses is a slow signal, not a warning. Not even vengeance. It is persistence. Something sticky, something one wishes the victim to feel long after death. Whoever killed Eldon Drum did so not in anger, but in rehearsal. It was Wolfe's version of a shiver, and just like that, the syrup wasn't funny anymore. It was just after 9 the next morning when Mara Kelton arrived at the brownstone. She wore the same turquoise apron as before, clean this time, and a neutral expression that didn't quite mask the caution in her eyes. I showed her in and offered a seat, which she took with the upright posture of someone prepared to deflect blame with grace. Wolfe didn't rise to greet her, of course. He remained ensconced in the oversized chair behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded but unblinking. Fritz had brought in hot coffee, but it remained untouched on the tray. The atmosphere in the room was somewhere between confessional and interrogation chamber. Miss Kelton, Wolfe said, his voice smooth as oiled parchment, I thank you for coming. I trust Miss Goodwin conveyed the nature of our discussion. She nodded. He said you wanted my version of things. Not quite. I wish your facts, your version of things would arrive regardless. That landed with the soft thud of a philosophical jab, but she didn't flinch. Impressive. I'd like to start with your relationship to Mr. Eldon Drum, Wolfe said. I didn't like him, she said evenly, but I didn't want him dead. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Wolfe murmured. Why did you dislike him? Because he was manipulative. He could charm anyone outside the co-op, but inside he ruled by veto. He rewrote recipes, rejected new suppliers, and insulted staff in ways that sounded like compliments. I stayed because I believed in what we were building, and because your exit contract required his approval, Wolfe said. She glanced at me. Anson told you that. He did, I said. Off the record, of course. That clause wasn't my idea, she said with a note of bitterness. It was his. Eldon insisted on unanimous consent for any member leaving the cooperative. He said it prevented philosophical rot. Wolfe made a noise that might have been a scoff or just a breath catching on a thought. Tell me, Miss Kelton, where were you the night before Mr. Drum was found dead? At home, she replied. I live in Jackson Heights. Alone. I made soup, watched television and read part of a memoir about bee farming. If you're asking whether anyone saw me doing those things, no, they didn't. That is unfortunate. It's also the truth. Wolfe's gaze didn't flicker. You knew about the molasses. I saw the jar was gone before the police showed up. I knew what it meant. How? Because Eldon made meaning out of everything, she said sharply. Every recipe, every product name, even the damn label. He wrote essays about flavor and revenge. You read enough of those and you start to see the signs. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. Then perhaps you can help me with this. Why would someone go to such trouble to stage Eldon's death, not merely to remove him, but to make it look like a natural end, softened by sugar? She hesitated. To make a point. What point? That he got what he deserved, but no one would go to prison for it. Thank you, Miss Kelton, Wolfe said, dismissing her with a small nod. You may return to your business. Mr. Goodwin will be in touch. When she'd gone, Wolfe said nothing for a long while. Then, as if summing up a chess match before moving a pawn, he muttered, She understands the language of symbols too well to be excluded, but she does not radiate guilt. I'd put her at low tension, high intelligence, I said. The kind of person who plans meals and murders 3 weeks in advance, but only carries out the first. He didn't smile, but I saw the corner of his eye twitch with approval. Next came Anson Flade. He arrived 15 minutes early and smelled like worry and eucalyptus. "You asked me to come alone," he said nervously as he sat down. "I told Mara and Leo I was running errands. I hope that's all right." "It is preferable," Wolfe said. "I want each of you unflavored by the others." Anson chuckled faintly. "That sounds like something Eldon would say." Wolfe didn't acknowledge the humor. "Mr. Flade, did you kill Eldon Drum?" The bluntness knocked Flade off balance. "No. God, no. I found him difficult, unbearable, even, but I wouldn't." "You feared him," Wolfe said. "Why?" "He controlled everything," Flade replied. "The co-op, the investors, the story we told the press. He kept secrets about our finances. I suspect he cooked the books, but I never had proof." "Why not leave?" "I tried. Twice. He rejected my departure both times, citing stability and the bylaws. I was stuck, unless he died." The way he said it quietly, but without dodging the implication, told me this was a man pushed to the edge, not one who jumped off it. Wolfe nodded. "Did you see Mr. Drum the day before he died?" "No. I hadn't seen him in 3 days. Do you believe Mara or Leo could have done it?" "I don't want to believe that," Flage said. "But Leo's dangerous when cornered, and Mara, she's the smartest of us. If she did it, we'll never prove it." "That's a paradox," Wolfe said, but not an answer. "Thank you, Mr. Flade." He left looking relieved, which meant nothing. Even honest men looked guilty in Wolfe's chair. Leo Drum arrived late. He didn't knock, didn't apologize, just strolled in like he was being charged by the minute and expected us to cover it. "I don't have long," he said, dropping into the red chair. "I assume this is about Eldon." "You assume correctly," Wolfe said. "Mr. Drum, did you kill him?" Leo smirked. "Do you think I'd come here if I had?" Some men enjoy dramatic irony. Leo shrugged. "I was at my sister's party. I've told everyone. There are photos. You were also seen outside the warehouse the morning Eldon was found." I said. "By someone who had no reason to lie." I said. "Unless you want to claim there's a Molasses conspiracy." Leo's smirk shrank. "Fine. I was outside. I wanted to talk to Eldon, but he wasn't answering his phone. I figured he might be at the warehouse. He wasn't. End of story." Wolfe folded his hands again. "Why did you need to speak to him?" "Because I was going to force his hand," Leo said. "We had an investor ready to buy out Eldon's share, but he kept stalling. I was going to deliver an ultimatum. You believed he'd back down." Leo smiled thinly. "Everyone did. Eventually. Thank you, Mr. Drum." After he left, Wolfe was silent for nearly 5 minutes. Then he rang for beer. Only when Fritz brought it and the first sip was taken did he speak. 3 suspects. All had motive. All had opportunity. Only one lied. "I waited." "The spoon," Wolfe said. "Only one of them avoided speaking of it." I nodded. "Leo," Wolfe's eyes glittered. "Indeed. And he would have no reason to omit it unless he feared how much he'd noticed." I leaned forward. "Are we close?" "We are closer," he said, to understanding the performance. "But we do not yet know who the audience was meant to be. And that, I thought, might be the key to the whole syrup-drenched mystery." It was late afternoon when I swung by Saul Panzer's place. Wolfe had told me earlier in the day, flatly, and with no allowance for argument, that Saul was to tail Leo Drum for 24 hours, and do so as if he were a scentless breeze. Saul had responded with his usual efficiency, a nod, a notepad, and a quiet, "He'll never know I was there." With Saul on the job and the suspects thoroughly interviewed, you'd think Wolfe might take a breather, but not this time. Something about the case had him pacing, not physically, of course, heaven forbid, but mentally. He'd withdrawn to the plant rooms after Drum's visit and hadn't re-emerged for dinner, which in our world was a Category 5 disturbance. Fritz nearly called the fire department. I left him to his orchids for a while, and went back over my notes, cross-referencing timelines, motive angles, and Molasses. The trouble wasn't in the inconsistencies, it was in the consistency. Every suspect had a clean, unbroken narrative, smooth as syrup and just as opaque. At 8:47 p.m., Wolfe summoned me to the office. He was behind his desk, a bottle of Löwenbräu at his elbow, and a finger resting lightly on his cheek, which meant he was about to test a theory, one he hadn't entirely committed to, but wanted to poke with a stick. "I have a hypothesis," he said, without waiting for me to sit. "Not yet a conclusion. I'm on tenterhooks." He gave me a look that suggested he knew I didn't know what tenterhooks were, then continued. "The death of Eldon Drum was not a crime of passion, nor one of profit. It was," he paused, "a curated event, a performance. The molasses, the spoon, even the absence of physical violence. These are symbols. And the audience?" I asked, following his earlier breadcrumb. He nodded. "Yes. The performance was not for the police. It was for someone who understood the meaning. Someone who would recognize the tropes. Someone like Mara," I said, thinking aloud. "She understood Eldon's metaphor-laced personality. She even predicted how he'd be posthumously styled." "Yes. But Mara is methodical, practical. If she had done it, it would have been clean, silent, no syrup, no spectacle. Leo then. Perhaps. He had reason to send a message. But he also had a temper, and the subtlety of a dropped anvil. It's possible he tried to look cleverer than he is. That left ends." Wolfe read my mind. "Flay is not above suspicion, but he lacks initiative. He's reactive. His molasses was accidental, not strategic. I do not believe he would think to stage a metaphor, much less trust others to decode it." I paced to the window and leaned on the sill, watching the occasional cab prowl. 9th Avenue. "So if none of them fit cleanly," I said, "are we missing someone?" Wolfe didn't answer, which was his way of saying yes. The next morning, Saul checked in by phone. His report was short, surgical, and as always, solid. Leo left his apartment at 8:10. Met a woman for breakfast. Judith Quinn, marketing consultant, works with the co-op. They talked for 25 minutes, mostly about Eldon. She cried. He comforted her. Then he went to a bookstore, bought a mystery novel and headed home. He comforted her. I asked, "Did it look natural?" Saul made a sound like he was deciding how much sarcasm was permitted in a surveillance report. "No, it looked practiced." "Keep watching him," I said, "and do a quiet check on Judith Quinn." When I relayed all that to Wolfe, he gave a grunt that hovered between satisfaction and annoyance. "We have our audience," he said. Judith Quinn. She knew Eldon well. She knew how to read him. Wolfe's, that is a rarer intimacy. At Wolfe's direction, I paid Miss Quinn a visit that afternoon. She lived in a high-ceilinged apartment over a florist shop on MacDougall Street, the kind of place where every pillow seemed to have a backstory, and the bookshelves were curated by mood. She was elegant in a soft-spoken, candlelit kind of way. Mid-30s, neat bun, voice like linen. She greeted me with a polite smile and a guarded gaze. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, ushering me in. "Ensign said you might call. Is this about Eldon?" "In part," I said, "also about molasses and spoons." She gave a wan smile. "Then you've come to the right place. I spent 2 years editing Eldon's product copy. I know every metaphor he ever used, some of them twice. You were close, in the way you are with someone whose chaos you're paid to shape." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because someone killed him, and they did it with flair." She didn't flinch. "You think I had something to do with it? I think whoever staged it wanted you to understand it." She went still. That quiet kind of still that signals internal triage, her hands clasped in her lap. "That sounds like Leo," she said finally. He wanted to be deeper than he was. He'd quote Eldon's lines back to me, only louder. He hated being second. But you were closer to Eldon. She nodded. Professionally. And emotionally. In a way. Eldon didn't like people knowing he had weaknesses. But with me, he let the mask slip. Not often. Just enough. You think Leo resented that? Absolute. I left 10 minutes later with a business card, a subtle perfume on my coat, and a suspicion that Wolfe had been right. Again. That night, Wolfe summoned me for what he called positioning. I will invite them all to the office, he said. Together. The timing is right. The pressure has built. He closed his eyes. We are no longer seeking proof. We are seeking collapse. Psychological, not legal. And you think one of them will fold? One will snap, Mr. Goodwin, and we must be ready to catch the truth as it falls. As I called the suspects and set the time for the next day, I realized something Wolfe had known for at least 24 hours. The spoon wasn't a clue, it was bait, and someone had just taken it. They arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, an unusual punctuality that I chalked up to fear, guilt, or the certainty that Wolfe would disapprove of anything less. Mara Kelton was first through the door, lips pressed tight, no apron this time, just a slate-gray blouse and a thin gold necklace that didn't move even when she swallowed. Flage came next, still looking like he expected someone to jump out from behind a curtain and revoke his right to breathe. And finally, Leo Drum, walking with that exaggerated calm of someone trying not to appear nervous. His collar was unbuttoned, tie gone, confidence fraying at the edges. Wolfe didn't rise when they entered the office. He never did, but the presence he projected from behind that massive desk made it clear who was in command. I was in my usual spot by the globe, notebook open, pen ready. Fritz had brought water, no beer, no brand. Wolfe had made it clear this wasn't hospitality, it was theater. Thank you for coming, Wolfe said, as they took their seats in a loose triangle before him. You are here because Mr. Eldon Drum was found dead. The police have ruled it natural. I have. Leo opened his mouth, but Wolfe lifted one finger and kept speaking. Each of you had reason to despise him. That is not remarkable. Eldon Drum was, by every account, brilliant and unbearable. His death, unmarked by struggle, wound, or overt intrusion, was at first glance a reprieve, but it was also a message, carefully arranged. He let that hang for a beat, then turned to Mara. Miss Kelton, you said Eldon liked meaning, that every label he wrote, every phrase, was coated in metaphor. You were correct. His death was no exception. Mara said nothing. Her fingers flexed once on her lap. To stage a death using molasses, his most florid ingredient, was not just theatrical, it was personal. And the spoon, Wolfe's eyes drifted to Leo. That was punctuation. One he used often. You recall his phrase, Mr. Drum. Everyone in the business world carries a spoon, some to stir, some to steal. Leo's mouth twitched. Cute line, he muttered. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but when repeated post-mortem, it ceases to be clever. It becomes a signature. Someone wanted to frame the moment in a language only a few people could read, one of them being Miss Judith Quinn. Flage looked up, startled. Mara's brow rose slightly. Leo blinked too quickly. Yes, Wolfe said, catching it. Miss Quinn, the marketing consultant who spent the last 2 years translating Eldon Drum's chaotic prose into coherent branding. The woman you had breakfast with yesterday, Mr. Drum. Leo gave a shrug, so casual it looked forced. She was upset, he said. She needed to talk. And you comforted her, I added. You who hated Eldon, consoled the one person who might actually mourn him. Leo's face tightened. So what? I felt sorry for her. No, Wolfe said. You were testing her. You wanted to know if she understood, if she saw what you'd done. Leo stood abruptly. I didn't kill him. You're lying, Wolfe said, without raising his voice. Everyone froze. You were seen outside the warehouse the morning he was found. You claimed it was coincidence. That is false. You were checking whether the message had been delivered, whether the right molasses had been used. The bitterness disguised blend. Sit down, Mr. Leo hesitated, then slowly sank back into the chair, jaw clenched. You've wanted Eldon gone for months, Wolfe said. But more than that, you wanted to beat him. Not just erase him, but outwit him. Leave him posthumously speechless. So you crafted a scene. You knew his weaknesses, his heart, his vanity, his metaphors. You prepared the syrup, left the spoon, and trusted that Miss Quinn would read the signs. She didn't, Leo muttered. No, Wolfe agreed. She was too grieved, too human. The irony, Miss Drum, is that you constructed a message for an audience that didn't show up. So instead, you found another stage. You came here, Mara's voice cut in, low and cold. You planned it like a pitch, like a product launch. Flage swallowed hard. But how? Eldon wasn't poisoned. There was no struggle. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, I stood. We found a flask in Leo's desk drawer, hidden. It had residue consistent with a heart rate suppressant. Nothing illegal but powerful enough in the right dosage to nudge an already weak heart off a cliff. You bastard, Mara said to Leo. You knew about his condition. Leo looked around, realizing the air was gone. The show was over. It wasn't murder. It was persuasion. You poisoned his tea, Wolfe said. A single dose slipped into a cup he always drank before bed. You left no fingerprints, no sign of struggle, just sweetness. Just symbolism. It wasn't supposed to be tragic, Leo said, voice cracking. It was poetic. I gave him what he wanted. A final act. Flage stood up, white-faced. You killed him. Leo shook his head. He was going to destroy the co-op. He had a private deal. He was planning to sell everything to a corporate brand. Got the mission. Reduce it to a label. I stopped him. You stopped a man from doing what you were too cowardly to fight him over. Mara, you hid behind honeyed murder. Wolfe raised a hand. That is enough. Silence fell. You will go now, Wolfe said, addressing Leo. You will wait to be contacted by the authorities. Mr. Goodwin will handle the transition. Leo didn't argue. He stood, turned and left the room. The door clicked softly behind him. Flage and Mara stood too, shaken. Neither spoke. As they reached the front door, Mara turned back. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. He nodded once. They left. 10 minutes later I returned to the office. Wolfe was still seated, eyes closed. That went well, I said. Fuss, he replied. Dinner in an hour. Yes. Tell Fritz I want roast duck, with orange reduction. And tell him I do not want to hear the word molasses. I grinned. Fair enough. As I turned to go, he added quietly. Metaphors are best left on the page, Archie. In life they tend to stain. I left him there, beer in hand, the room finally silent again. Justice Wolfe style had been served, and yes, dinner was magnificent. The next morning, I found Wolfe in the plant rooms, standing. Now you have to understand, when Nero Wolfe stands voluntarily, and there's no fire, gunshot or culinary crisis involved, something's up. He wasn't pacing, heaven forbid, just shifting from one foot to the other slowly, like a particularly large bear testing a patch of soft ground. I didn't interrupt. He doesn't like being spoken to in the plant rooms, unless it's about orchids, rain schedules or the shape of a new leaf. So I waited by the threshold until he sighed and said, "It is done." "The case?" I asked. "No," he said. "The point." Mr. Drum believed he had crafted a moral argument. He believed murder disguised as poetry could taste like justice. It could. I let that hang for a moment, then cleared my throat. So if that's wrapped, I suppose we can expect Inspector Kramer to storm in with a face like curdled milk. Fuss. He's already been notified. That was news to me. Wolfe must have sent word during the night, or made one of his rare strategically brief phone calls to plant a seed. Either way, the man was always 2 steps ahead when it counted. Sure enough, around 11, Kramer arrived. He didn't storm, which meant he was in the pre-boil phase, but his face gave off a heat that suggested the lid was rattling. "You knew yesterday and you waited until today to send this over." He barked the second Fritz showed him into the office. Wolfe didn't rise, and he certainly didn't flinch. "Inspector, you're here." "Excellent." Kramer planted himself in the red chair like it owed him money. "You sat on this, Wolfe. A man's dead, another's guilty, and you wanted to get your philosophical remarks just right before calling me in." "I was establishing motive," Wolfe replied calmly. "The mechanics were insufficient. Mr. Drum left no forensic evidence. His method was subtle. You would have lacked grounds." Kramer scowled. "You saying I'm stupid?" "No," Wolfe said, not quite kindly. "I am saying that Miss Drum believed intelligence could shield him from consequence. I needed to ensure your net had no gaps." Kramer turned to me. "And you were fine with this?" "I was fine with not wasting your time until we had more than syrup and suspicion." That got a grunt, which is as close to agreement as you're going to get from the man unless you save his children from a bear. Wolfe slid a folder across the desk. "All transcript. Mr. Goodwin's notes. Saul Panzer's surveillance report. Photograph. Medical speculation from a friend of mine at Mount Sinai. You will find it quite tidy." Kramer flipped the folder open, scanned the first few lines and let out a breath through his nose like an overworked ox. He didn't say thank you, and we didn't expect him to. He just stood, nodded once, and left. That was when things finally started to feel settled. Or so I thought. An hour later, Anson Flagg called. His voice on the phone had that edge, the kind that made you reach for a pen and postpone lunch. "I just spoke to the investors," he said. "They want to keep the co-op running. They're appointing Mara and me as co-directors. Leo's shares are being seized under the contract clause about destructive action to the cooperative's mission." "That's swift," I said. "It's business," he replied. "Also, Mara wanted me to tell you something." "Tell me yourself." "She said to thank you for seeing past the mess and into the intent." I didn't pass that one on to Wolfe. He would have scoffed, muttered about women with dangerous vocabularies, and retreated to the orchid room, but I appreciated it. Later that evening, I found myself flipping through one of Eldon Drum's old product brochures. Flagg had left it behind during our first meeting. The man had a way with words. I'll give him. One passage stood out. "The bitterness at the base of molasses is not a flaw. It is a memory. The taste of the soil, the labor, the fire. To sweeten something fully is to forget it, but to sweeten with restraint, that is remembrance. Poetic, tragic, even, and when used as a framework for murder, a little nauseating." I laid the brochure aside. Dinner that night was coq au vin. Fritz had outdone himself. Wolfe ate with the deliberate satisfaction of a man reclaiming his sanctuary. One forkful at a time. The office had been scrubbed of guest chairs. Leo Drum's voice and all traces of metaphor. Over dessert caramel custard, not molasses-based. I leaned back and said, "So what'll you remember most about this one?" Wolfe dabbed the corners of his mouth with his napkin, took a sip of beer and said, "That a man who spoke of flavor as ethics used death to author a message. A bitter irony. More bitter than molasses." He gave me a look, the kind that says a wise man would stop. I didn't. "You ever think you and Eldon would have gotten along? You both like precise language, symbolic depth, controlled environments." He snorted. He surrendered control the moment he trusted symbols to act in his stead. "I have no use for theatrical murderers, Mr. Goodwin. I prefer my justice undecorated." That, I admit, was hard to argue with. After coffee I left Wolfe to his books and retreated to my room. The case was closed, but something stuck with me. Maybe it was the image of a spoon laid beside a body, or the woman who cried for a man no one else missed. Or maybe it was this. Even in death, Eldon Drum had tried to tell a story. But Wolfe had told the final chapter, and as always, his version stuck. 2 days passed. The brown stone was back to its natural order, quiet, temperature-controlled and free of both syrup and strangers. Wolfe had returned to his routine like a pendulum snapping to its swing. Mornings in the plant rooms with Theodore, lunch at 1, beer at 4, dinner at 7, no interruptions unless fire, blood or Fritz forgetting the salt. I had a backlog of expense reports to file, and a drawer full of notes from past cases I kept meaning to burn. But I wasn't quite ready to move on. Not yet. Something about the Drum case still clung like the scent of clove in a closed jar. It wasn't that justice hadn't been served. Leo Drum was awaiting arraignment. The DA had everything wrapped tight, thanks to Wolfe's dossier, and Mara Kelton and Anson Flage had taken over the cooperative without a public whisper. Yet there was an aftertaste to the whole thing. A strange, slow-burning disquiet, the kind Wolfe pretended not to notice, until late that afternoon. I was in the front room flipping through the Gazette, when Wolfe summoned me with a low, perfectly enunciated Archie. No raised voice, just that tone that made you drop what you were doing like a hot skillet. I stepped into the office. He was in his chair as usual, but he'd rotated it slightly, not facing the door, not quite looking at me either. The beer on the desk was untouched. "I have received a letter," he said. He didn't hand it to me. He didn't need to. Anonymous, I get. No. Signed, Judith Quinn. I blinked. Judith, the one Leo tried to impress with the whole poetic corpse routine. Wolfe inclined his head. She has left New York. Permanently. Voluntarily. I believe so. She writes that she regrets having helped shape a man who mistook prose for philosophy and flavor for fate. She also enclosed a page from Eldon Drum's unpublished journal. Now that caught my attention. She was the one editing his materials, wasn't she? If anyone had access to his private writing, she did, Wolfe said, and chose to share this after the case was closed. He reached into the side drawer and produced a single sheet of paper, which he passed across the desk. I read it aloud. June, the molasses blend is nearly perfect. Not just in taste, but in metaphor. There is bitterness in even the most delicate finish. That's the truth. What matters is whether you allow the bitterness to bloom or bury it beneath sweetness. The co-op wants polish. I want honest. One day, they'll understand the difference. I've been thinking about how one might end a life with flavor, not in the poisoner's sense. No crude vial in a teacup, but a symbolic end. One that lingers like a good finish on the tongue. If I were to die, I would want it to say something. Something that makes people think about what they swallowed, and why. I handed the page back. So he was halfway to scripting his own end before Leo even reached for the flask. Indeed, Wolfe said quietly. Leo may have executed the performance, but the script was already written. Meaning what? That Eldon invited his own death? No, Wolfe said, but he romanticized it. Enough for someone to believe they were honoring his wishes. I gave that a moment to settle. He made murder seem like a tribute. Yes, and Leo fell for it. Wolfe nodded, as others might have, in different circumstances. That is the danger of metaphor left unchecked. It convinces the foolish they are profound. I sat down. So what are we left with? A man who wrote his way into death. Another who believed himself a co-author. And a woman who now carries the burden of editing both. There wasn't much to say after that. Wolfe doesn't deal in catharsis. His conclusions are precise, not poetic. But this one had reached deeper than usual. Even he looked a little heavier, as if the moral weight hadn't quite settled yet. That night, dinner was quiet. Roast lamb with rosemary. Fritz had outdone himself. Wolfe didn't speak until the custard. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "how would you prefer to be remembered?" I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. I'm not picky, I said. Ideally not surrounded by cloying smells or allegory. Maybe a drink named after me, a chair with my name on it, a line or two in a memoir, something about good shoes and bad timing. Wolfe grunted. Acceptable. What about you? He sipped his beer. I would prefer to be forgotten. Fame is too often a distortion. The facts, if accurate, will suffice. That was the closest he'd ever come to sentiment, and I wasn't about to press it. After dinner, I stepped out for a walk. The air was warm, thick with the scent of late spring. On the sidewalk, a couple passed by holding ice cream cones. A cab honked without urgency. Life was trudging on, slow and sweet and indifferent. Back at the brownstone, I passed Wolfe's office. He was still there, rereading Judith Quinn's letter with a look I couldn't quite place. Not surprise, not regret, just stillness. And I realized something. For all his distaste for symbols, Wolfe had just solved a case about them, decoded a death, wrapped in narrative, peeled back a metaphor, until the truth inside was bare and breathless. Maybe Eldon had wanted a death that meant something. Wolfe made sure it meant the right thing. In the end, the molasses was washed away, but the bitterness, that stayed just long enough. We called it closed, but I knew better. Some stories don't end, they just stop speaking, and some flavors never quite leave the tongue. The next morning, I was halfway through an uninspiring stack of receipts, cab fares, coffees, and one lunch I hadn't enjoyed but had to pretend to when the doorbell rang. It wasn't Fritz's scheduled grocery delivery, and it was too early for the mail. I got up, opened the door, and found a tall man in a brown linen suit, holding a book in one hand and a question in his eyes. Mr. Goodwin, that's me. He extended the book like an offering. I'm Peter Castor. I was Eldon Drum's editor at Marlowe House. I took the book, Refined Residue, Essays on Flavor and Meaning. The author's name on the spine glared up in gold. Eldon Drum. Castor smiled faintly. I thought Mr. Wolfe might like to see the manuscript. He'll find the final essay particularly illuminating. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Let's find out. Wolfe was already in the office, seated and sipping his second beer of the day, one of the darker German imports, reserved for when he was in a contemplative mood. He looked up as we entered, studied the man for half a second, and then said, "You are the editor?" "Yes," Castor replied. Eldon's posthumous book was nearing publication when he died. We debated pulling it entirely, but Judith Quinn urged us not to. She said Eldon would have wanted it finished, warts and all. Wolfe gestured to the chair. Castor did, straight-backed and formal like a student before an exam. "I believe the essay you wish me to read is the final one?" Wolfe asked. "Yes," Castor said. It was his last submission. He called it a philosophical treatise masquerading as food writing. I thought it was overwrought, but after your findings, I reconsidered. I flipped the book open and began scanning pages. Wolfe didn't move. Castor watched me like a man waiting for someone to identify a body. The final essay was titled The Sweetest Silence. I read it aloud. There are things sugar cannot cover. Guilt, for instance, or the weight of potential wasted. But molasses is different. It has depth. It holds memories. Molasses doesn't pretend to be pure. It contains fire and ash and dirt, and it lasts. If one were to leave a message not on paper but in the act of dying, it should be laced with molasses. A death with molasses would be heavy. It would not vanish quickly. It would leave a stain, but it would also nourish, in a way. It would warn. It would remind. I do not seek death, but I understand now that it is a dish best served slow. I closed the book. Castor was looking at Wolfe. "Well," Wolfe said after a pause, "it seems Eldon Drum spent the last of his intellect preparing to be mourned in metaphor." Castor nodded. He thought he was writing art, but it feels now like he was writing bait. Wolfe made a small, disdainful noise. He was indulging in vanity, hoping death would validate his ego. He got more than that, I said. He got killed. Castor gave a weak nod. The irony, of course, is that Leo Drum read the manuscript early. Eldon shared it with him. For feedback, he said. Wolfe's eyes opened. He read this before he killed him. Castor nodded. A week before. That's why I came. I thought you should know. If Leo needed motivation, he found it in Eldon's pages. Not motivation, Wolfe murmured. Permission. We sat for a moment in silence. Even the traffic outside seemed quieter. Castor stood. I'll leave you the copy. I only ask that if you ever speak publicly about this, remember that the publishing house did not endorse his ending. We will not speak publicly. Wolfe said. The police have their story. We have the truth. Castor inclined his head and left. I stayed behind, tapping the book's spine against my palm. So I said. Drum gave Leo the idea, wrote his own death in sweet, sticky prose, and Leo thought, why not bring the fantasy to life? Wolfe nodded. It was not premeditation in the legal sense, but it was ideological groundwork. Leo simply took the next step. You still think Leo's guilty? Of murder? Yes. Of intellectual theft, most certainly. He copied a man's death the way a plagiarist copies a poem, believing execution would excuse origin. And the editor? I asked. He was a messenger. Wolfe said. No more, no less. That evening, I sent Saul Panzer a copy of the essay, with instructions to discreetly confirm the manuscript timeline. Within hours, Saul reported back. Yes, Leo had read it. Yes, he had commented on it. No, he had not liked the ending. Too abstract, he'd said in a memo. He'd made it concrete. After dinner, pan-seared trout with lemon caper sauce. I brought Wolfe a small plate of almond cookies and asked the obvious question. Do you think it'll happen again? No, he said. Not this way, but someone else might try to turn death into a thesis. He sipped his beer. Then someone else will have to read their intent back to them. In plain language. That is our role. I let that settle in. Later that night, alone in the front room, I opened the book again. I read the last lines of the essay and then closed it for good. There would be no sequel, only residue, only taste. And this time, no one would swallow it whole. 3 days later, life at the brownstone had returned to its default state, predictably scheduled, insulated from nonsense, and orbiting Nero Wolfe's routines like obedient planets around an oversized sun. The orchids were thriving under Theodore's care. Fritz was in culinary form, and Wolfe had yet to emerge from his chair for anything more strenuous than a glance toward the globe. Me, I was catching up on my correspondence, and wondering when the next client would darken our doorstep with another bundle of secrets. But there was still a faint echo of the last one, the kind that didn't vanish with an arrest or a filed report. It showed up again at 10 in the form of a padded envelope postmarked from upstate. Inside was a hand-labeled jar of molasses and a typed card. For Nero Wolfe, from someone who almost mistook bitterness for truth. JQ. I carried it into the office and dropped it on Wolfe's desk, without a word. He looked at it as if I'd presented him with a beetle in a gift box. What is this? He asked, already knowing. A farewell, Judith Quinn. He didn't touch the jar. I don't suppose she included a confession, he said dryly. Nope, just the molasses. Symbolic, he muttered. Damnably persistent. These people. She didn't kill anyone, she enabled someone who did. That makes her complicit if not culpable. I waited for the usual follow-up, a quote from Cicero perhaps, or some remark about moral responsibility, but he said nothing more. He simply stared at the jar, then reached into a drawer and dropped it in, still sealed. That's the kind of closure Wolfe prefers, physical, literal, and as far from poetry as possible. I was ready to put it behind us for good when the phone rang around noon. I answered, half expecting it to be Saul with some final coda. But it wasn't. It was Mara Kelton. "I wanted to speak to you, Mr. Goodwin," she said, "before I left the city. Leaving for good, temporarily. There's a retreat center in Maine. They offered me a short-term contract to help develop a food sustainability program. It seemed healthy, probably lacking in dead business partners," I said. She laughed, softly. "That too." There was a pause. "The kind that wants to be filled but isn't sure how." "I'm grateful for what you and Mr. Wolfe did," she said finally. "But also, curious." "About what? Do you think Leo regretted it?" "Even a little." I glanced toward the office door which Wolfe had closed, a rare courtesy that meant I was free to speak my mind. "I think Leo regretted being caught," I said. "But more than that, I think he regretted that the performance didn't land, that the people he wanted to impress, the audience he curated, saw the truth instead. So in the end he failed, in every way that mattered." She let out a breath. "That helps." We said our goodbyes. I hung up. Wolfe never asked what the call was about, and I never offered. That evening, over a dinner of braised veal and wild mushroom risotto, Wolfe was uncharacteristically talkative about truffle varieties, the idiocy of modern menus, and the decline of paprika quality in post-war Europe. It was his way of resetting the clock, cleansing the palate, but something in his tone was off. Not quite weary, not quite resigned, pensive. When dessert arrived, "Apple tart, tartan with brandy cream," he said. "There is a risk, Mr. Goodwin, in assuming that logic will always triumph over aesthetics." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean in the kitchen?" "I mean in the mind. Eldon Drum wrote his own eulogy before his death. Leo Drum performed it. Judith Quinn interpreted it. And yet none of them achieved clarity. Their gestures obscured truth, rather than revealing it. And we cut through it." He gave a small nod. "As we must, always." After dinner I found myself lingering in the office. The jar of molasses was still in the drawer, unopened. I looked at it and thought about legacy, not the kind Wolfe respected, built on fact and merit, but the kind people try to leave behind like breadcrumbs, hoping someone will follow them into meaning. I thought about Eldon Drum, whose words were remembered more than his action, about Leo Drum, who mistook symbolism for absolution, about Judith Quinn, who finally walked away from the echo chamber, and Mara Kelton, who against all odds might actually come out clean. At a little past 10, Wolfe emerged from the dining room and stood in the doorway. "Miss Goodwin," he said, "I am going to the plant rooms. Do not disturb me unless a bomb detonates." "Got it." He paused. "The jar, still here?" He grunted and turned away. Later I thought about throwing it out, but I didn't. I left it in the drawer, a sealed reminder, because cases don't always leave scars. Sometimes they leave jars, and sometimes jars are worse. The next morning, I watched the city wake from the front stoop. Delivery trucks groaned past. A kid chased a pigeon. Somewhere someone was probably bottling a new artisan syrup and writing a tragic story to sell it. But not here. Not in this brownstone. Here we solve the story before it sells. And if there's bitterness, we don't bury it in sweetness. We name it. We close the book. And then It was late afternoon and raining softly. The kind of gray drizzle that settled into the bones of the city without bothering to announce itself. Inside the brownstone, it was warm, orderly, and perfumed faintly with lemon oil from Fritz's fresh polished banister. Wolfe was in the office, reclined in his chair, a volume of Pliny the Elder balanced on one knee, and a glass of beer within reach. I was at my desk, finishing a final round of notes for Kramer's case file. Not that he'd read them, but we like our I's dotted and our T's crossed, even when the NYPD would rather scribble. The drum case, as we had labeled it, was over. Leo had been indicted. Judith had vanished into quiet obscurity. Mara Kelton was planting basil in Maine. Anson Flagg was back to overseeing shipments and looking more alive than he had in years. But the echo of it lingered, as all the strangest ones do, not in guilt, but in the gap between intention and result. I leaned back, tapped my pencil on the edge of the desk and said, "You know, I've been thinking." Wolfe closed the book without looking up. "You've been ruminating, Mr. Goodwin. You ruminate when a case leaves philosophical crumbs on your plate." "Fine," I said. "I've been ruminating about Leo. He wasn't a fool, not exactly, but he was weak. He wanted to impress people. Judith, the investors, even you in some backwards way. Do you think that's why he did it the way he did? Because plain murder would have made him look ordinary?" Wolfe opened one eye. Leo Drum's crime was one of vanity, not hate. He mistook theatricality for depth, and like many men who fail to create, he stole someone else's words, someone else's mystique, and he thought the act would elevate him. Instead, it made him pathetic. "No," Wolfe said. "It made him transparent. A man who kills and then demands to be understood is always easier to catch than one who disappears." I mulled that for a second. So the whole performance, the molasses, the spoon, the quotations, what did it prove? Wolfe reached for his beer, took a deliberate sip, and set the glass down with reverence. That the intellect, unguided by principle, is a dangerous thing. Mr. Drum built a ladder out of borrowed words and climbed it toward illusion. He wanted justice to be flavored. But justice, Mr. Goodwin, is best served plain. I admit that landed. It wasn't the kind of line you write down, but it stayed with you anyway. Fritz called from the dining room. The sound of plates being set carried through the walls like the prelude to a sonata. I stood, straightened my tie and glanced at Wolfe. "What's on the menu?" "Duck à l'orange," he said, "with couscous and green peppercorns." "No molasses?" Wolfe gave me a look, half glare, half fatigue. "Phooey," I grinned. "Just checking." We made our way to the dining room. Outside, the rain had started to fall a little harder, tapping against the windows like someone trying to get in. But in the brownstone, all was as it should be, steady, full, and absolutely under control. As Fritz brought in the soup and Wolfe adjusted his napkin with surgical precision, I thought about how the world never really stops trying to dress up its sins with sweetness, with metaphor, with clever little scenes that distract from the rot. But here, in Wolfe's world, we strip that away. No decoration, no disguise, just truth, boiled down until it holds its shape. And that, like Wolfe's cooking, and his justice, always satisfies, even when it leaves a bitter finish.